Okay. Thank you very much for sticking right the way through to the last session of the day. You are the indefatigables. You would have been there right the way up until the armistice moment in 1918. You'd have stuck around for VE Day and so on. So, was it Henry V says, "We few, we happy few, we band of," and actually, that's really rather the point that we're going to be talking about, or one of the points we're going to be talking about. We band of brothers. We're going to be talking about men in the context of conflict and war. And one of the things that we've agreed to do is not just to talk about, as people tend to, war as the kind of terrible shame that it is and so on. I think most of us worked out by now that we wouldn't actually like, on the whole, to be in a war ourselves, and that we're lucky, most of us, that we won't be, and certainly that we won't be forced to be. But what are the things that happen to men in wartime? And frankly, as we look around the world, what are the attractions to men of being warriors and combatants? What are men doing together? What are their relationships with each other? And then also to women in the context of war and conflict. And what we have here is a rather splendid panel, which is well versed to talk about it. I think the thing that we should just say, though, is that the one ex-combatant we were to have, who was Victor Gregg, who's 95. When you're 95, relatively slight cold can actually make life very difficult for you, and Victor couldn't come. We're very lucky to have in the centre Rick Stroud, who not only can speak on his own behalf as a writer about war and people in war, but also has written several books with Victor Gregg about Victor's experiences, and in a sense can channel Victor. Now, what we weren't quite clear about is whether or not he could make it clear to you when he was channeling himself and when Victor. Now, one way he might be able to do that is to keep the green scarf on for himself and then take it off when it comes to whichever you feel would be right.
I'll hold the green scarf when I'm Victor.
On Rick's right is Owen Shears, who is a playwright and writer and so on, of no little distinction. And I've said to each of the panellists that I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time going through just how distinguished they are. Take it from me, they're distinguished. If you want to know more about Owen, look him up on Google. It takes about half an hour to get through all the things that he's done. He's a remarkable person. And I'm very glad to have him here. And then on my immediate right, all the way from New York City, Jimmy Briggs. Jim is, like me, is a journalist and writer, but one of the things that Jimmy is specialised in, as you'll see from the programme, is looking at the business of child soldiers and so on, but has been to quite a few conflict areas. The person who was volunteered to go first, because after all this is about men and conflict, and that's one of the things that happens, is Owen. Owen, if you'd like to begin.
Oh, great. Thanks. No, it's right. Rick told me it was going to go the other way if I look surprised. I'm
sorry.
No, that's fine. No, well, thank you so much for being here. I thought what I'd do is I would read to you from Pink Mist, but just to give you some background to what Pink Mist is. It's a verse drama that I wrote, informed by around 30 interviews that I did with very recently wounded young service personnel, and they were very young. It's interesting, that David was just talking about child soldiers, and it's not a phrase that we often associate with Britain, but of course Britain is the only country in the EU where you can join the army at 16 and you can actually begin the process at 15 3/4. So a lot of people I was speaking to had started the process that early, and they were either psychologically or physically wounded, but I also spoke with their families, with the mothers, the wives, the girlfriends, the people who really, as I saw, had to very much stay on the front line of those woundings, quite often for the rest of their lives. I'm going to stand up to read from Pink Mist with that seamless switch between microphones. And I guess I chose this extract. So Pink Mist is the story of three friends from Bristol who don't so much choose to join the army as choose to leave their current situations. But having joined the army, they undoubtedly find certain attractions in that life and in the promise of war. And I chose this extract, which is from the point of view of Arthur, who I suppose is the main character, really, because it opens with him talking about one of those attractions, which very much focuses around the idea of a certain kind of intimacy I'll then do a slight jump to Arthur coming back for his 2 weeks R&R, which was a gap in the tour of duty, which nearly everyone I spoke to said that they would rather not have had. And it finishes with a short poem from the point of view of his girlfriend Gwen, which I guess is from the other end of that spectrum in terms of intimacy, and about how it can be very difficult to achieve, having had that intimacy of conflict. So this is in the voice of Arthur. They called me King. Arthur, get it? Everyone gets a nickname, and that was mine, King. Rifleman Arthur Brown, 256 543, but to the lads in the battalion, always King or Kingy. New name for a new family, that's how it works. And at first, don't get me wrong, that's what I loved. A tightening down of the pride and the bond. It starts with your regiment, their history, their badge. Then as you go on, it's a deepening of where you belong. Your battalion, your company, your platoon, your section, all the way down to your four-man fire team, until that's what you're fighting for, the man on your left and the man on your right. Forget queen or country, the mission or belief. It's more about keeping your mates alive or avenging the ones who've already died, because that's what fuels war, though no one will say it. Love and grief, its rougher underside. It's ironic, really. The whole thing was my plan, for us to link our arms again, join up together. And at first it worked for Hads and Taff. I mean, Hads found his skill as a valiant man, a pride in each patrol that he brought home. And Taff, he was just up for the fight from the off. And he was good at it too. Even better after what happened to Hads. But me? Yeah, I enjoyed it. No denying that. The contacts were a buzz. The real thing, no safety locks. Shore beat parking Mazdas down Portbury docks. The fighting's 90% waiting. And when you've got that much time, you think, and that's when the trouble starts. Because we're privates, aren't we? And that's not our job. I checked into a hotel outside Bryce. Lay on the bed till dawn, scared to close my eyes, then got the bus to Severn Beach, first thing. When I got there, the place was empty. Nothing. Severn Beach, end of the line, literally. Just the bridge disappearing towards Wales and the river wide as a sea, sluggish under it. Not even the fishermen yet hooking their bait, casting their lines. Just the houses, all safe and sealed. Severn Beach, it's where I'm from since the age of 1, but I may as well have been back in the field on patrol or in some village in Afghan. It all looks so strange, unreal. I let myself in, dropped my kit to the floor, then climbed the stairs, quiet, so as not to wake Mum. I opened the door to my bedroom, footy posters on the wall, the same checked duvet, a kid's room, a flashback to before this began. Then before I know it, I'm on my knees, opening the bottom drawer in the chest, pulling out old T-shirts and vests to uncover under them a row of eggs blown and bedded in their cotton wool nests. We had this thing, me, Hads and Taff, out by the bridge in Clifton. We dare each other to touch bits of rock, pushing each other further and further out onto the open limestone cliffs. That bit there with the moss, that white patch, the outcrop, that kind of thing. One day I thought I'd give them a scare, so I climbed further out past the dare, went right out of sight, slipping in under an overhang, then sitting tight as they shouted my name, shitting themselves. I dropped and they'd never see me again. Stupid, really. Still don't know why. But I'm glad I did. Because it was only then that I noticed the bird, a peregrine, circling above me in the gorge, screeching a repeating cry. I looked to my right and I saw why. Her nest scraped out of soil on the ledge, and inside, right in the middle, 2 perfect brown speckled eggs. Hads and Taff were still shouting for me, but I couldn't hear them no more. I edged along closer and again, I don't know why, reached out and took one, still warm. And now, 3 years later, here it was again in my T-shirt drawer. The first of 12 eggs I collected that spring. Heron, jackdaw, crow, lapwing, but the best was always hers, that peregrine's. I knew it was wrong even then, but I was 16 and wanted something just mine, a secret I shared with no one, and maybe that's why on that R&R I went straight back to them, because each one, though empty, was full with the feel of the day when I found it. The touch of the wind, the taste of the rain. Each was a moment alone, again, a stealing of an egg and more. I put my hand into the drawer. picked up the herons, a pale sky blue, barely there on my palm, smooth and cool. I closed my eyes and tried to see that day again. It was March. I was bunking off from school. A breeze in the reeds, the water over my boots. Stupid thing to do. To think I could get away so easily, no chance. As soon as my eyes were shut, I saw them instead. Those two Yanks, the ones who said they'd take our place, who drove on ahead to the front of the convoy, then round a corner where? By the time we got there, their Humvee was a ball of flame burning in the middle of the street. I saw them climb out, both on fire. They ran, who knows why, but they did. Two burning guys, puppets of flame. The first, blinded, ran into a wall, tried to stub himself out, then fell. The other carried on down the street 10, 20 feet before dropping to his knees. He held his arms out for a moment, a flaming cross, then tipped forward onto his face and died. I opened my eyes. Sweat on my wrists. I was back in my childhood room, footy posters on the wall, the opened palm closed into a fist, the pale blue shards of the heron's egg scattered inside the drawer like a broken promise. That night, when you finally came home, I felt like that egg in your palm, crushed to the bone. We'd waited so long. We joked about it. I'd even sent you porn. But we both knew this could be us at our best, together, tender, close. My hands on your back, my breaths on your chest. I used to feel blessed when we did it. And I know you did too, stunned by how easily we made one out of two. But not anymore. Afterwards I wanted to weep, but I didn't want to show you that. I'd expected lust, yes, but it wasn't. It was anger, and not spent either, but still there, as you pulled out of me and sat on the edge of the bed, getting dressed. We going out, that's all you said, like nothing had happened. Yeah, I replied, trying to understand what it was that had died. Looking back, though, perhaps you were right, because nothing is what it was. Nothing. That's what you filled me with that night. Thank you.
Rick.
If Vic were here, he would have absolutely agreed with the beginning of that poem, that what being a soldier, a lot of what being a soldier is about is the man on either side of you and the sort of love of the comradeship of it and the loyalty to each other. And Vic lives in a little sort of sheltered enclave run by the Rifle Brigade. And he says to me, I've known him for about 8 years now, he said, the thing about these blokes, Rick, he said, I don't like any of them. He said, but they've all put their head above the parapet, and that's their real mates because of that. So he's got a very sort of subtle view of comradeship and what that means. And I was just reflecting on what the manly virtues are, and they are one thinks of them as being loyalty, comradeship, leadership, and Vic has found that. And I mean, just to give you a quick overview of his life, he fought right through the Second World War. He was at Alamein. He was blown up 3 times on the first night of Alamein in a carrier that he was in. He saw his best friend Frankie Batt blown to bits, and that event stayed with him all his life. He then went on, retrained as a paratrooper, dropped into Arnhem. At the end of the second day, when he was dropped in, of the 800 men who dropped with him, only 90 were still standing. All the rest were dead or wounded. And in the whole battle, 10,000 men, of 10,000 men, 7,000 were wounded, killed, or taken prisoner. Vic was taken prisoner. He was in the rear guard. He was a machine gunner. He was used to killing hundreds of people. He was taken to a labour camp. He attempted to and did succeeded in sabotaging a soap factory for which he was condemned to death. He was going to be shot the next morning, and that night they kept him in a huge prison in Dresden, and that was the night it was firebombed. And he says to me, Rick, I was used to killing blokes. That was okay. He said, face to face with another bloke, hand to hand, whatever you wanted, but to see women and children being sucked up in the air with their heads on fire or just exploding, he said, that affected me for the rest of my life. And it did affect him for the rest of his life. But the funny thing about Vic is that his position is that he hates war and anything to do with war, and he's seen war. He thinks women are much more important than men. But, he says, if necessary, you still have to fight. He said, I'm not a pacifist. I don't want anybody to think that. But he has all the virtues of a pacifist. And that led me on to sort of reflect on these virtues. And I was thinking about Homer, and the Greeks. And you've got the Greeks, who are basically a bunch of thugs hanging around on the plains of Troy, and they are in love with violence, war, slaughter, revenge, all the things that we think of as heroic, and they have armour that shine. Homer describes a lot of them in terms of light and brightness, and light shining out from their armour, and they love violence, they love killing people. They're never happier than when sort of skidding around on the entrails of their enemies. And it is sort of glorious stuff, and I think blokes do to get carried away on that, on the sort of comic book element of it. And then I reflected on, I'm a Christian, and I think, that the virtues of loyalty and comradeship were manifest in our Lord, who's Christ, who's a completely different kettle of fish. And his line is, you turn the other cheek, you're not violent, you do anything to avoid violence, and in the end you sacrifice yourself for the benefit of your comrades. I mean, in his case, the immediate band of comrades are the disciples, but his comrades are you and me, and he gave his life for that. And again, he is described often in terms of light. So the Homeric Greek hero and the Christian hero are two completely different but male things. And then the paradox in my mind is that I am writing about the women of F section of the Special Operations Executive, who were 38 very brave women who were parachuted into France during the Second World War. And when they were trained, the men would go, well, of course, she's very nice, but she has no leadership potential. She may be able to run a safe house, and that'll be all right, but she won't be able to lead anybody. These women had all the virtues that I've just described. They were loyal to each other, they were comradely to each other, and they turned out to be great leaders. And the woman in particular, who was told, well, she'll never have any leadership qualities, ended up at the end of the war leading 5,000 tough French maquisards against the Germans. And this same woman had no compunction when they discovered a traitor in their midst in one of the networks. This person was tried and condemned to death, and none of the blokes would shoot him. And the woman said, well, I'll do it, and just shot him in the back of the head and said, well, that hasn't spoilt my breakfast, someone's got to do it. So the paradox in my mind is that we've inherited these so-called male virtues, and yet give women the chance, and they're just as good at it, and they can do the same thing. And that's what I've been discovering the last 6 months of writing. So in a way, I think I don't know what being a man is. I think I'm beginning to understand what being a human being is. And that's really all I can say, using those three examples. And Vic is, this brave man who really did fight, fired his machine gun, killed thousands of people. He's got the same paradox inside himself, and he misses his mates, but he wouldn't want to go to war again. He wouldn't want us to go to war again, but if necessary, he would let us.
Jimmy.
Wow. At first, I was very hesitant and reluctant to go first. Now, after my two colleagues haven't gone, I wish I had gone first at this point, following these two gentlemen.
Wherever you go in the patrol, there's some kind of...
Exactly, there's always something waiting for me. My perspective, which I'll be very brief, introducing my perspective and my background, is looking at the frame of war not as a participant or a victim, but as an observer. For most of my professional life, I was a journalist for almost 20 years, and I really feel, it occurred to me, actually, as Owen was reading that amazing excerpt, it was so moving, that in terms of my relationship to war and conflict, it was really a love affair, if you will, because I suspect, at least in the States where I'm from, many young men and boys growing up as I did in the 70s and 80s were very enamored by the depiction of war in popular culture, mainly through movies and TV shows. So, coming of age when movies like Rambo and Platoon and all these depictions, sometimes more realistic, sometimes surrealistic, of war, were appearing in theaters. Before you have these hyper-realistic video games we have today, like Call of Duty and so forth, we had the movies. And so, coming from a family where my grandfather was in World War II, driving a truck in the Pacific, My father was in the Army during Vietnam, and there wasn't necessarily an over expectation that I would join the military, but a part of me knew that I wasn't really fit to be a soldier, just because of my own awkwardness and having flat feet and being nearsighted. I knew I was not who they'd be seeking. But still, I think one of the things I hope we talk about is soldiering or going to war as a path to manhood, because I think from my own experience, but what I saw over 20 years as a journalist, I think it's a very, very real consideration for a lot of young people, like young men especially. I think I would say more so today, just because of how, I would say that how war is so sanitized in its presentation, but how the games and the movies really, really numb young people to what war really is. For myself, in my career as a journalist, I started off documenting war as a reporter for Life magazine. And I'm so glad, if I had to go cover war, I'm so glad I did it in that position, because I was very blessed, if you will, lucky enough to get to know and get to talk to people such as Philip Jones Griffiths, who did Vietnam Inc., Welsh photographer, and Don McCullen, who shot for the Sunday Times, and really studying their work in the Vietnam era and before, but also to being able to study the work of other photographers and journalists, some of who died in Vietnam or in Korea, such as Larry Burroughs and others. And one of the things that became clear to me for myself that that has been really the perspective I can give best about conflict is sort of the other side. I never embedded. I was never with national army. One of the wars I covered, I was always covering it from the side of the opposition, of the guerrillas, of the civilians. So that began with documenting the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, but then continued on in Palestine with the Second Intifada in 2001, and spending time with the rebels in Colombia in the late 90s and early 2000s, and spending time with the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, spending time with the guerrillas in Eastern Congo. And for me, I said it was a love affair, because before I even started covering conflict, I feel like I was preparing myself for it without really knowing it. In the States, I wrote a lot of stories about gangs and drug violence in the States, Chicago, New York, where I live, and other places. And then when the time came to go to Rwanda, I felt, I'd seen people killed before, I'd seen bodies. But this is my chance to kind of prove to myself, but also prove to everyone I grew up with, that I was strong, that I was a man. Even though I wasn't going to be carrying a weapon, somehow I felt there was an honor in what I was doing, because I had no weapon, I had no body armor, no helmet. All I had was a camera and a pad and a pen, maybe a recorder. And going to the places I did, not being embedded, even in Afghanistan, where I spent almost 6 months there after the U.S. invaded. I wasn't with U.S. soldiers or Allied forces. I was with the Taliban. I was with civilians who were having to deal with the aftermath of these national armies going to that country. And initially, at least as a non-soldier, non-combatant, observing soldiers in combat, I have to confess now, with some degree of shame, it was a rush. It was a high, if you will. That sense that any moment, you might not walk away from something, or there's that level of risk was stimulating. And I not only saw it in myself and my peers, but I did see it in the soldiers I observed, whether they were non-governmental or governmental. For me, though, the love affair ended pretty quickly, because I saw it on both sides, governmental soldiers and non-governmental soldiers. Really, the level of dehumanization that happens in war, which you never really see completely unless you're really there or have been there in some capacity as a journalist or aid worker, as a soldier. It's really hard to describe the level of dehumanization and desensitization that's necessary for war to take place. For me, it really happened in going to Eastern Congo, and I went there actually with an Irish photographer named Derek Hudson, who lives here, and we were there for Life magazine. We spent 3 months in Eastern Congo and Rwanda, and initially we had gone in to spend time with soldiers who were fighting to overthrow Mobutu. At that time, the country was called Zaire. This is in the 90s, and both the soldiers fighting to overthrow Mobutu and Mobutu's forces were committing these horrific acts of war, in which if the situation existed for there to be a tribunal, I think both people from both sides would be held accountable. whether it was mass rape, whether it was using child soldiers, whether it was mutilation, these very egregious, really crimes against humanity, against the humanity of these people. And I think that for me, I'll echo what was said before. For me, war became something repulsive and distasteful, which I felt compelled to talk about. And so for me, I focused on child soldiers. At the time that I started writing about child soldiers, almost 20 years ago, the numbers were much lower than they are now. Now, because of the wars in Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan that are continuing, there are more kids now than when I wrote my book on child soldiers 10 years ago. And I think it's because, one, we're not actually seeing these kids in our daily news coverage, but also, the people who use children to fight see them as a necessity. Because in many situations, especially when you're fighting a guerrilla war, there's a depletion in the number of male candidates who are able to fight, either because they're captured or they're dead or wounded. So, inevitably, you turn to the kids and the women. And so through that path, I saw really how war interrupts childhood irrevocably, because even those kids who did manage to escape or did manage to be rescued after being wounded, their childhoods cannot get those back. That part of their journey had been taken away from them, interrupted, if you will. And I think, one of the things that now in this weird way, I have this weird relationship with war because I'm not a journalist anymore. I don't cover war anymore, but still I find myself drawn to it, not as an observer, but really as a support. Right now I'm doing a lot of work at West Point, which is the U.S. Military Academy, where young Army officers are trained before probably going into combat, working with West Point, working with veterans in New York and other places across the United States, with people who are really dealing with the psychological injury that Owen referred to. I mean, now there's a phrase called moral injury, moral trauma, because what's being recognized now is that the soldiers, at least presently, who are coming back home, if they're coming back home, even physically well-bodied, there's this moral injury that's happening because they're not, we're addressing issues of homelessness and the physical injuries that are happening in war now, but we're not really, really processing or deprogramming soldiers. And we program them to go out and to kill and be prepared to kill, but there's no deprogramming after they come home. So, they still have that switch on. They still have to deal with the guilt or the consequences of what they've done in a space where it's not being discussed. So I'll stop there because I know you want to keep going.
Thanks very much. The number of words have come up through the course of what everybody has said, and they're interesting words, and we'll look at some aspects of what they mean. I mean, just to take you back through what some of them are: proving yourself, the rush, the high, the intimacy, the love affair. Love affairs are very interesting, and then right the way down to something like dehumanization. Actually makes you wonder whether you mean dehumanization, whether actually what you're not seeing is just a form of humanization. It's just one that we don't like, but we can kind of discuss, what happens to people under those circumstances. And I want to first ask each of you a question about yourselves. Did you fight at school? Owen?
Not off the rugby pitch. That's a very specific answer. No, on the whole, well, no, I didn't. But I was an avid rugby player. You might argue, coming from Wales, you can't avoid to be that in school. But actually, no, but I did. And I spent my teenage years into my early 20s playing rugby. And undoubtedly, there were things that I found in the sport of rugby, which is a very physical sport and also is a team sport and a bonding sport, that was some of those psychological and maybe social hungers that I identified in the boys that I spoke to. Now, they were finding them satisfied in violent conflict. I was finding it in sport. And I think, looking back, undoubtedly rugby was a very important outlet for me because as a teenager, as a male teenager, especially hormones going all over the places, I think you do become quite fascinated by violence. Undoubtedly, I was interested, even though I haven't got any sort of military history in my family, I was always interested in conflict and war, and can remember someone like Robert Harris saying, there's a hole in modern man where a war should be. He said it interestingly at a time when the British Army wasn't actively involved in conflict. There have now been many conflicts to fill that hole. So no, I didn't fight, but I was definitely intrigued by that world. And funny enough, I mean, post-university, I briefly thought about joining the army, and it was a fascinating period. I mean, we now look back on it with a retrospective clarity, but it was when Britain was contributing to the United Nations peacekeeping force. I met a very impressive army captain who sold a very good argument of, if you want to make an active difference on the world on the ground, the army is now where you should be. And I went quite far down that line, but I discovered maybe a different kind of awkwardness to what you were talking about. But I realised that you've got to be able to follow orders. And there's no way that I would have ever been that person. And there's a reason why you can only join the army as an officer up to a certain age. After that age, I think it used to be 27, I could be wrong. I think you're considered too much your own man, and maybe not as malleable as you need to be for that situation.
Mm. Rick, did you fight?
I didn't, but can I just say something? I mean, I'll answer that question. Talking about being a soldier and being a hero, I met a Marine a captain who was in Afghanistan the other day, and he was leading a patrol into a very, very dangerous place. And those patrols are covered by snipers who've got sights that can see for a mile. And he got a thing saying, "Governor, I can see a dicker," which means there's somebody on a roof somewhere with a pair of binoculars. And this guy said, so this is very dangerous, because that person with the binoculars can bring fire onto that platoon. And the officer that I was speaking to said that he then said, "How old is it?" And the sniper said, "It's 12." And he said, "May I have permission to open fire, Governor?" And he said, "No, you may not." He said, "If we start shooting children, we'll be as bad as they were." The tension inside the patrol after that, which was attacked, and they lost a man, was severe, and the tension when he got back to his base or whatever was also severe. And I think that was a very heroic action, and it shows that soldiers can operate independently. They're not just automata. I am a closet soldier. I mean, when I was at school, I loved the cadet force. I mean, I didn't fight. I boxed, but I didn't do...
You boxed?
I boxed. I mean,
Why?
I was because I was forced to. I hated it. I mean, and I was good at it, but I was always beaten, because I'm just at an age where I was always put in with a man who was, or a boy who was slightly older than me and much heavier, and he'd always lacerate me. And
Okay, I'm going to make this point. Both of you two didn't fight.
No.
You didn't. I mean, because I'm interested in some of the uses of language that you get about people who do fight, like he can look after himself. Kind of phraseology like this. What about you, Jimmy?
I don't want to digress and take off course, but I will say I did fight throughout school up until university, not because I was a hyper aggressive person, but often out of necessity, because I was at risk of being bullied, because I went to a school during a time that was very segregated, so there was a lot of racial tension. So for my own well-being or survival in that context, I felt I had to defend myself and had to fight. But it wasn't natural to me. It wasn't like who I felt I was.
And when you were involved in a fight with somebody, let's say you had to hit them in the face, how did you talk about that to yourself? How did you think about that? How did you think about your violent self?
I felt shame, actually.
Yeah?
I felt shame. I really felt shame about it, because I just felt like I felt like I had failed my intellect. Like I felt like I was raised to believe you should be able to like use your I mean as simple as it may sound, you should be able to reason your way or talk your way, or use your ration to minimize situations. But so whenever I fought, it was like my father was always proud. But my mother was like shaking her head, like, you could have done better than that.
It's quite interesting that all three of you are essentially peaceful people, in the sense that, the reason why I asked this question is just to discover whether or not this was something which was intrinsic to you. And yet all three of you found yourself attracted, in the way that you, Owen, said, to trying to discover something about people who did get involved in violence. So again, sticking to your own motivation, let's say, Rick, why, given that you were peaceful, did you? I mean, there's all kinds of things you could write about, think about, look at, that don't involve this. Yet this was it.
What you mean? Why am I interested in the war?
In wars, soldiers, fighting. And this is not criticism, by the way. I mean, it's not a kind of...
No, because I think that I mean, I've never fought. I've never been on a battlefield. I mean, if Vic Gregg were here, he spent his entire youth, up to the time he was 18 when he joined the army, fighting real serious street fighting. And he said, well, it teaches you how to handle yourself. And that was a natural part of his, working class world. For me, it was much more, it began by being fantasy. I think about the war every day of my life, and I have done since I was about 8, I think. And to begin with, it was just in comic book terms. And as I said, I was in the cadet force. I loved all the exercises and crawling around at night and firing rifles, but it was never real. And then I began to see that the real thing about the battlefield that it is a test of people, and it's a very sort of extreme environment. It's an extreme form of real life, and how people behave in that environment is very, very interesting. So I've got a comic book interest on the one hand, and a feeling that there is something philosophical about the nature of battle that reveals the true nature of man, and by man I mean men and women, that is very, very interesting, and that's why I can't stop writing about it.
That's a very interesting answer. I mean, going back to, because you partially covered this point, but one of the things you're bound to notice about, say, great American journalism of the 50s and 60s, by men mostly, is the moment when they feel obliged to cover the heavyweight championship of the world. And it comes back to this kind of notion of the extreme test and your notion of dehumanization. If you are testing yourself as a human being, you could argue that it's kind of a meta-humanization that's actually going on under those circumstances. It's not we want to disown it by calling it dehumanization, but a lot of the other language that we've used actually stresses its incredible attraction.
I think it is a demonization, David, because from my perspective, because I was actually thinking about the story that you told about the 12-year-old and not taking the shot, which surprises me because when I was working on my book, I remember I spoke a lot to the U.S. Marines, and there was I can't remember what year it was. It was in West Africa in the 90s, and I think they were a group of British soldiers. And you two will correct me if I'm wrong, but someone will correct me if I'm wrong, that were either assaulted or some of them were taken hostage by a group of guerrillas in West Africa. I think they were part of the West African peacekeeping force. And I remember this U.S. Marine talking about that case because, in that situation, as he described it to me, that their capture was in large part because the officer, maybe some of those soldiers, could not bring themselves to fire on child soldiers. And ever since that point, the U.S. Marines were the first ones to do it in the United States. And I think now the Army does it as well. But in their officer training school, they talk about child soldiers, which is amazing to me. But they tell them, if you see a child with a gun, that person it's a person with a gun. It's not, you can't think about the age or their childhood. That child could take out 4 or 5 people from your unit. So you're responsible to your men or your women first. And I do think it's dehumanization because to do the things that war requires one to do today as a soldier, whether you're operating a drone from Arizona that's flying over Syria or Iraq, taking out people through blips, or if you are an infantry on the ground, up close, to be able to take a life in that way, you have to dehumanize the person. Otherwise, your feeling connection to them as human beings will prevent you from doing it in the first place.
If you ever seen interviews with the last hangman, what you see is that they are not dehumanized, actually. Although what they do is something, and have done, is something that we would deeply dislike. But anyway, let's not cover about the language. It's an interesting point. Yes, sure. And then Owen, yeah.
Sorry, just about dehumanisation. When Vic Gregg's best friend was blown to bits in front of him, and this lorry was blown up, and he tried to get his friend's body out, and the body just fell into 2 parts. Vic said that for the next 3 weeks, they didn't take any prisoners. They were just and they were just like robots, killing anything that came their way.
Yeah, well, I guess on this question of dehumanisation or not, I think it's certainly not easily black and white. And you're right that, some of the elements of attraction that I was talking about, especially with the people who I interviewed, a lot of them who had gone through care, a lot of foster homes, there was a sense that they were discovering a part of their humanity in that sense of belonging and doing something important. You're at that age, this is where war is an exploitation of youth, not just in terms of the physical youth, but also youthful ideals. And it's very interesting. You watch videos with young jihadists, and I think of the interviews I did with young British soldiers, there's a hairline between a lot of their motivations. And this comes back to the psychological and emotional hungers that contemporary society isn't satisfying, that unfortunately violent conflict is. But undoubtedly, the dehumanisation happens as well. And I was surprised to hear that story, because every soldier that I spoke to who just served in Afghanistan left me under no illusions. If there was a child carrying a gun, they were, you know,
Maybe he was unique, but
a target. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how also I think we want to categorise areas of dehumanisation. So, in the film of American Sniper, they give him a real moral conflict over when he has to shoot a child holding the bomb. In the book, he displays none of that moral conflict. He's very, very definite. But then you mentioned drones. In my most recent book, I write about a drone pilot operating out of Creech, and I do so because I was fascinated to learn that the drone pilots have a much, much higher level of PTSD than fighter pilots ever did. And it's because 99% of their job is to witness, is to learn the habits of these people, to see when they play chess on a Friday, you know, when they visit their grandmother, and then the order comes down the line to kill them, or maybe they kill someone else accidentally, and it's so intimately voyeuristic.
No, I mean,
And then you have to go down, you drive down Highway 95 and you put your kids to bed, and the human mind is not built for that juxtaposition. That actually, it's not, I think it's too easy for us to say, oh, it's just like a video game, because it's not to these guys. And there's been a lot of very powerful whistleblowers, and probably the most powerful line in my book is from one of them. And it's this young guy who said, I wish my eyes would rot, I've seen too much.
okay, thanks to the panel too very much for being here.
Thank you.